And now I'd like to welcome up the Water Quality Association and Pexium to talk a little bit about their journey and success after implementation. So come on up, guys.
Hi, my name is Patrick Dorsey. So I'll give you a little story that I think is fitting that we're following kind of Chip and Adele's. But Jonathan Adams from the Water Quality Association, we had a little traffic issue this morning beyond the detour that we all got the note on. So it was about 9:15 and Carol and I are looking at each other repeating like, where's Jonathan? Where's Jonathan? I don't know. Where's Jonathan? Right? Which is great because we're going to talk about implementations and life after go live, right? And we know that like most people probably in the room, whether you directly or your team looks at implementations as a total crisis, right? Particularly from an infection standpoint. When we're talking about AMSs, everyone's like, oh my God, I didn't sign up for this, right? And so one of the things we're going to talk about, just that journey, really, not just through the implementation, but life after the implementation. And as Kevin mentioned earlier when he was introducing us earlier, it's like go live is just a milestone, right? And for some organizations, it means cake, right? There's a little party and the vendor brings you cake, right? And then it's like the hard stuff begins. Now, what do we do? And we're going to talk about just that journey and some of those best practices. So let's see. We'll keep going. So while we move forward, there we go. Thank you. So I introduce myself. I'm Patrick Dorsey. Let me take a moment to have Jonathan and Carol introduce themselves as well.
Jonathan Adams, Vice President of Innovation for Water Quality Association.
And I'm Carol Herzog. I'm Implementation Team Lead from Pexium.
This one. See, need a little help there. Thank you, Kevin. Got to press the right buttons, right? That's the key. All right. So one of the things we're going to talk about as we prepare for changes, like post-launch is really this, we're at the fun part, right? But this is where everything starts to take shape. Like, what are we going to do, right? And some of the things we're going to talk about today and to consider is like, what is that roadmap for post-implementation success? So just to share hands, how many people have had like a major, if you will, technology implementation in the last 12 to 18 months? Yeah, there you go. How many are planning one perhaps in 2024, right? You have the budget, you got a plan, you're like, here we go. It's all part of our resource strategy. There you go. I'm not going to call on you later, but we should share hands. And for those that have already started it, what would you say? Good, bad, things are going well, some speed bumps. See some heads nodding. That's good. Everybody can relate to that. And so if you take a step back, what were some of the major, if you will, changes that the organization had to go through? Was it more from a technology standpoint? Was it personnel or process? All of the above? Yeah, we're seeing shaking some hands. All of the above. So we're going to talk about all of those things as we prepare for that going forward. So one of the things that we've learned from an Impexium standpoint, and I'm often in charge of managing some implementations internally at ours, is that when we look at some of those best practices, we tend to look at like most implementations, it becomes people at the top, the smallest percentage. It's all about the technology. We focus on, hey, we got a new website coming, we got a new AMS, when really change management has a lot of emotion, right? And we have to think about how is this impacting people. Then we talk about process, and technology is actually, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if it's an AMS, the website, marketing automation, but how do we manage those emotions with the change management? And so I'll turn it over to Jonathan from your point of view. Like you just went through a major implementation from an AMS standpoint. What were some of the things that you needed to do to motivate the team or focus on the people versus perhaps the technology?
Yeah, so I think a big part for us was just understanding where everyone was within the organization in terms of embracing change, right? So we had our membership team who was ready to get rid of the old AMS, they're gung-ho, they want to take over the world. You have the accounting team, which for any of you, if anyone in your organization hates a curveball, it's the accounting team. It's your finance team. They like predictability. They like structure, no surprises. no deviations, right? And then for us, we had our education team who was also going to be another primary user of the AMS, and they were already going through a lot of change. So we were changing up our structure from a mentor-based approach to more instructor-led training. They were also going through an LMS implementation at the same time. So understanding that their change muscle was already being exercised quite a bit. So they had a little bit less tolerance for change, or they would be a little bit more exhausted as we discussed changes within the AMS. So that was definitely a key part for us.
So when we typically launch an implementation or some type of change management exercise, there's 3 questions that we ask our clients, or internally we ask ourselves to consider, right? Like, how do we create that change management environment? So we have some safety nets, if you will. How do we talk to people so they're not afraid of change, right? And then there's always that element of like, what should we change versus what should we not, right? Like, what's working? And Carol, you have implemented hundreds of clients across multiple technologies. What are some of those like best practices you see of like, how do people address to know what they should change versus what they shouldn't?
Yeah, so the organizations I've worked with who've been really successful in their change management, they've planned out the metrics that they will be using to measure their success. So determine what that looks like for their organization, what that success looks like, and laid out the roadmap for how they're going to measure that. They've incorporated feedback loops into the process. So checking in with the teams, assessing what they're feeling at each step of the way and how it's impacting them. And then once they reach a goal and make progress, they celebrate, make it fun. It's a stressful time for everybody, but making it fun just helps relieve some of that stress.
Great. Jonathan, what were some of the things that your team measured as you went through that journey?
So for us, it was a little bit more of an imprecise measurement, but just gauging where everyone was with their change. I think Impexium did a really good job of telling us kind of where we should be at every step of every phase of the project. So understanding if there was a team that wasn't quite there, and understanding what they needed. In terms of knowing what shouldn't change, I always like to think of it as kind of like one of those backup cameras. And maybe you have like the sonar with it as you get closer and it starts beeping louder and louder. As you get in those meetings and you see people start to tense up or give shorter, more aggressive answers, that should be kind of your test for, okay, maybe this shouldn't change, or maybe we should focus our attention elsewhere. Yeah, that's been key for us.
Chip is smiling because you referenced like body positioning. See how we tied that in?
Yeah.
But I also want to point out that Carol said we have to celebrate those milestones. So there's more opportunities for cake. It just doesn't have to be at the end, right? So we get to that prepare for launch stage, right? And this is critical, right? You got your launch plans, you got your checklist. Someone mentioned a checklist earlier. Every organization has a checklist. Associations love checklists. That's great. We have a rollback plan, right? There's like kind of pre-launch things. Some of the things that we've noticed that kind of often get overlooked because we're internally focused too is there needs to be a communication plan, right? When we talk, we talked about communications. How are we going to communicate this change within the organization? And that's not just to staff, right? It could be your other partners. Hey, we're rolling out a new website. What other technologies do we have in our tech stack that need to be affected? We should probably call that vendor so they know, right? From an integration standpoint. There might be members, external users, those chapter leaders. They want to hear from national, right? To know what's going on and not always hear it secondhand. So I encourage everybody, like, think about, as we're implementing these changes, there's various touch points beyond the obvious, right? So you got to almost look over that horizon and figure out who do we need to contact. And now we've had our cake, right? We have post go live. It's not just a milestone, right? This is where the fun begins. And we've broken it out into 3 phases really in the first year, right? And we're going to talk about like 0 to 4 months, 4 to 12, and then this kind of maintenance period. And the reason we identified year 1 is because it really takes a full year for that technology to set in, right? And we too often look like short term of like, okay, what are we going to do for the next month? We're going to have training, boom, and it's over, right? But we really need to focus on kind of stability. How do we build some best practices? And Jonathan, you just went through that implementation less than a year ago. When you just finished your milestone, hey, we had our cake. Now what are we doing? What were some of those best practices that the team implemented to kind of get off to that right start?
Sure. And I think for us, it really started before the go live, right? And being selective of which features that we were going to move forward with. There was a lot that was new, exciting, and shiny, and that we were really gung ho to implement. But, focusing on that first bullet point of stability is, what are our core functionalities for our members, right? Is this something that's going to be core to the member experience? If not, let's, turn it off for now. Let's ignore it for now and focus on what really matters, so that after go live, it's, there's less to maintain. There's less, you're still in that learning curve of using the tool day to day in that 0 to 4 months. So for us, that was one really key point of it. And then just, as we were in that 0 to 4 month, just having an overabundance of communication. I don't think that for those of you who have gone through these kinds of implementations, I don't think there's such thing as over communicating. No one involved in the project's going to say, hey, you're communicating to us too much, right? So that's definitely key for that.
Carol, when you think about a go live and people are embracing this new technology, what are some of those best practices you've seen to build that muscle memory, right? Like from a training element of how do we embrace the new technology?
Yeah, so during the implementation, identifying your team, the long-term team, who's going to be your power users, and getting them involved early, as even before your go live, so that they feel that ownership and they start to learn the system even before they need to be using it in the day-to-day. Introducing continuous improvement. So being flexible to changing your business practices and focusing on the outcomes you want, and then determining the best path to get there instead of just recreating the exact steps that you do today.
Jonathan, were there any specific tips that you could share with everybody? Like, here's the one thing I'm glad we did from like 0 to 4 months.
And I think it's, again, before that 0 to 4 months, but what really set us up for success was that data governance piece and the SOPs as well, is clearly defining what role everyone had in the AMS was really key for us, because that shaped what we did, how we did it, who was responsible for what. So after go live, as things went wrong, which they definitely will, you'll have those things pop up, everyone was on the same page as to who's dealing with what responsibilities lie with whom, and what the expectations were.
Great. So we're not going to expect operational efficiency from day one. We almost have to embrace the change, right? And again, keep staff engaged. We want to have that over communication. So we move on to phase 2, right? Not everything can be a top priority from an Impexium standpoint. And I see this too when we're rolling things out internally. This is where like staff kind of roll back to those bad habits, right? This is like, oh, this is the way we used to do it. And they're taking shortcuts, right? So some of the things we want to think about are like, how do we focus on what can be measured? Because I feel like we focus on what we measure. And if we're measuring it, right, it's easy to have that like North Star to look back and say like, okay, are we on the right path? So Jonathan, what were some of the things that from an organization standpoint you measured, to make sure that you guys were moving in the right direction?
Yeah, I think for us in this 4 to 12 month period, this was, in our post implementation period where, we no longer had Carol, who's amazing. If you can get Carol on your project, that's an easy tip for success. But Carol had transitioned off. We were on, Impexium support, and internally we were kind of talking, and our number of tickets, we felt like, oh yeah, we're having so many issues. But when we really grouped together, we looked at, how many issues do we have, right? And there were a lot, but okay, so there's a lot. Some of them were duplicative, so we weren't doing as good of a job as talking to each other and maybe utilizing some of that internal communication. And then again, measuring like, okay, how long has this ticket been open? And, you know, once we dug down and explored some of those, and I'll throw myself under the bus here, I'm as guilty as anyone, but we looked at it as like, oh yeah, this ticket's been open for a month. And it's like, okay, well, it took Impexium 2 weeks to get back to us because we marked it as low priority, which is another thing. Like, oh, we marked this as low because it wasn't important, but you know, it was more important than we, you know, prioritized it with our within the system. But also, it took them 2 weeks to respond. It took me 2 weeks to respond to their response, right? So, what if you dig down into those numbers? Like, what are we contributing, you know, to that delayed support? Delayed support timeline, and we were communicative both internally and with Impexium. I think that really helped us push it forward, reduce that backlog, and like keep everything working smoothly.
And I took a quick survey of our team as we were preparing for this presentation. It's like, what are those things that, you know, pieces of data that people are measuring, you know, across our client base? It could be revenue, could be like member impact, it could be like staff efficiency, or it could be how we capture data, right? So ultimately, every organization is going to prioritize those or different objectives based on their goals of what they need to move the organization forward. So, you know, it's always good to check back in with the team so they understand what they're measuring as well. We see often a disconnect when you have like the leaders who have made the decision and saying, here's where we need to go, and staff is not necessarily aware of like the what and the how and the why, and certainly what they're being measured on. So again, from that engagement standpoint. Now we've jumped forward, right? We're getting to that 12-month period, right? Everybody's using it. We've broken down the bad habits. We got a lot of good things in place. And we hit this maintenance mode, right? And we have to think about like, okay, what's working, what's not? And from that standpoint, like there are some best practices, right? And Jonathan, perhaps you could share like, what are some of the practices now that you're in this phase now, more or less? What are some of the things that you're doing now that have, again, are enabling the success going forward?
Yeah, and I want to say this is, you realize that you're in this maintenance mode once you're starting to cancel those department and user check-ins on a pretty regular basis. Again, for us, you know, we realized early on the need to ramp those up, and we're meeting weekly. Now it's getting canceled, you know, almost every week, and we're looking at, okay, do we meet quarterly? What's the new cadence? So as you start to develop that new cadence, as you start to look at more of those features of, hey, let's maybe we should roll this out. That's kind of how you know that you've hit that maintenance mode.
Were there any specific things that from a team standpoint you did so that people weren't rolling back into those bad habits as they moved into this phase?
Yeah, and I think, again, leaning on those SOPs and the data governance that we set up is just calling those out as you see them. It's like when you're writing the Metra and they say, if you see something, say something. Is if you see inconsistencies, if you see stuff that isn't in line with what was discussed or what the expectation is, calling that out, you know, in those team meetings.
Mm-hmm. Carol, one of the things I know we like to share with our clients is that concept of continuous improvement. And perhaps maybe you could share with everyone out there how we define it, right? And how they might be able to apply it to their organization.
Yeah, so we define continuous improvement as constantly evaluating your business practices and being flexible to change them to adjust to the changing needs of your organization, and improvements that are made in your system. Even from when Jonathan went live to now, there's things that have changed, new features that have been released, and so having that somebody on your staff who is keeping up to date on those things and can assist with the continuous improvement and changing of your evaluating your business practices is a key to that success.
Great. Yeah, so our last slide, we're just going to talk about, let's leave everybody with one critical tip maybe they can take back to the organization. To Kevin's point, what's the ROI of this session? I'll leave it with this. We encourage everybody when they're rolling out a new technology, budget for training, right? It's easy. The training's part of your implementation, but just put it in the budget for year 1, year 2, because there's always going to be new staff. There's always going to be part of that continuous, you know, improvement cycle that we want to be on, and you want to have it in your budget to leverage as you can. Tip.
Make it fun as you're going through the implementation, and even within the first year, be flexible and open to just having fun to try and keep your staff engaged.
For me, it's focus on the people, understand where everyone is coming into this change, whether they're excited, anxious, whatever. Establish those expectations early on, and be overly communicative and hold each other to those standards.
So on behalf of Jonathan, Carol, and myself, thank you very much for the opportunity to share that journey with you. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, guys. Just a reminder, if you have questions, hit that green button. And then also for those online, you can also send in your questions. There was a question, Jonathan, how did you prepare the board and Polly, your CEO, of the change management that was about to come?
Sure. So for me, it was having that very real conversation with Polly, our CEO. And as we laid out, we were planning for actual, starting the project and implementation the following year, as we were budgeting. But at that time, we were planning on, because everything was kind of expired, deals were expiring and things were shifting at the right time. So we were doing an LMS implementation, a AMS implementation, and a website platform change and redesign all in the same 12-month period. And she said, this seems kind of crazy. And I said, yes, you're right. And it's just understanding that it is going to be crazy. You need to simplify it as much as possible. And, the timing is right. All the other pieces are in place to make this happen.
Great, thanks. I know we were talking about tips and things of that nature, but if you had to go back, is there anything would have done differently, knowing what you know today, that would have an impact to the outcome in a positive way?
I can't say that there is. I think there would be things that, hindsight being 2020, oh yeah, we definitely want to test this scenario. But so much of the implementation is, you're changing things and you're not really going to understand or see all of the aspects of the change until you're actually in it and existing in it. So just maybe setting that expectation a little bit further that, hey, we're going to have a lot of imperfection in the next 12 months after go live. So I think if anything, it would be that, just setting the expectation of this is, we're going to get over the hump, but it's going to be rocky even after we get past all of the training, all of the configuration.
Actually, we do have a couple of questions here from our virtual participants. So how did you handle staff or individuals that were a little apprehensive of the change? Staff really are resistant to having their cheese moved.
Yeah, and it's I think it's, again, going back to that sonar example of understanding what things that they're going to guard very closely and what things that you can work with them on. And I think what really worked for us was from the outset telling everyone to put on their member glasses, because if you're looking at change, especially if it's going cross-departmental and suggesting change to another department, that's going to be met with resistance just out of the gate. But if you really go into those change conversations with the member need in mind, that makes that a little bit easier to digest, a little bit easier to move forward, is that we're not asking you to change just because this is a good change. We're asking you to change so that we can get this member benefit.
Great. Anything else for the team up here? Great, guys. Thank you so much.